In the final segment of the Determining the Content section, we will discuss various additional policies, procedures, and items to include within the handbook. There may be policies or practices that are not categorized within any of the previous sections, so a final section should be added to the handbook to include these items. The items we will discuss are generally popular items to include within organizations' handbooks. However, there may be additional items specific to your organization or industry that you may want to include. The items we will cover will include dress code policy, reimbursement policy, communications policy, which will cover internet usage, social media policy, telephone usage, email usage, and information security and cybersecurity. We will also include drug and alcohol policy, equal employment opportunity, affirmative action, harassment and non-discrimination policy, as well as workplace violence policy.
A common policy for many organizations is around dress code requirements and expectations for employees. It is important to note the dress expectations when employees are on company property. The dress code will most likely depend on whether the employees are in a customer-facing or client-facing role. Many organizations will require that their employees maintain professional appearance if they are in customer-facing roles and will allow for more casual dress for employees who do not see customers regularly. It is also important to note who is responsible for keeping the dress code standards and reporting infractions. For example, managers being required to oversee dress code policy.
Another common policy to include in the employee handbook would be information specific to the organization's reimbursement policy. Many organizations will have a determined set of processes for employees to be reimbursed for any expenses they pay on their own. It is also important to note that authorized travel by employees will be reimbursed at the current rate per mile allowance established by the IRS for the use of a personal car.
A general policy which is becoming more popular is guidance around the communications policy within an organization. It is important to note that the computers, telephones, and any other appropriate item is the property of the organization and is restricted to the use listed within the communication policy. Typically, organizations will have an umbrella communications policy to include specific policies such as internet usage, social media policy, telephone usage, and email usage. It is important to note the internet usage restrictions for employees who have access to computers. Many organizations will list that all internet usage within company-owned computers will be monitored and considered official records for the organization. All internet usage on company-owned devices should be appropriate, ethical, and lawful. A policy specific to social media use is also becoming increasingly popular within many organizations. There may be some roles that social media use is required for the position, so it is important to list these roles within the handbook. Any roles outside of those listed are not permitted to use social media during working hours and on company-owned devices. An additional policy around telephone usage is common within most organizations. Many organizations note that personal calls should be kept to a minimum in order to leave the phone lines free for customers and to take away from distractions within working hours. It is important to note that organizations should not be charged for any personal long-distance calls as well. And the final item to include within the communication section of the handbook would be a policy specific to email usage. It is becoming increasingly popular for organizations to shape a policy specific to information and cybersecurity. Employees need to be cautious of creating any risk to the organization through their usage of email. Information and cybersecurity applies to internet usage as well. Email use should only be used for business-specific purposes and should not include personal use.
Organizations should note that they are committed to having a safe and helpful workplace and that establishing a drug and alcohol policy reduces the risk of accidents and injury. It should be noted that employees who are found to be under the influence of illegal drugs or alcohol will be disciplined, which could lead to termination. If the organization has implemented any type of regular drug screening, it is important to note this practice and schedule in the handbook. And note that any information found from routine testing will be kept confidential. It is important to note that the organization is compliant with equal opportunity and affirmative action requirements. The Equal Employment Opportunity acknowledges that the organization does not discriminate in employment opportunities or practice on the basis of categories protected by law. It is important to note that under the Equal Employment and Affirmative Action, the organization will make reasonable accommodations for qualified individuals with known disabilities which are protected by federal or state law, unless doing so would result in an undue hardship for the organization. It is important to note the escalation process for raising any questions or concerns about any type of workplace discrimination or harassment. A final note to include is that the organization will not discharge or discriminate against employees or applicants because they have inquired about, discussed, or disclosed their own pay or the pay of another employee or applicant.
An important policy to include in the handbook is the prohibiting of harassment and discrimination within the workplace. It is important to note that the organization will not accept any harassment or discrimination which is based upon an individual's protected status. Harassment of an employee can include physical, verbal, or visual. The handbook should list the appropriate steps for reporting harassment and disciplinary process for acting in harassment or discriminatory behavior.
A final general policy to include in the handbook should be guidelines around workplace violence. The organization should acknowledge that they are committed to preventing workplace violence and to maintaining a safe work environment. It is important to note what type of behavior constitutes a workplace violence and how these actions will be disciplined. The handbook should also state how employees are expected to report violence within the workplace. Additional information around the items covered in this section are included in the resources section below.